The Famicom boom has arrived, along with the seeds of the Famicom bust. It's NES Works Gaiden, episode 45.
What a pitiful opponent. There is no way you can match the power of Delos Theta.
Although the nature of the Famicom's library had diverged wildly from that of what we'd see on the NES by the time the system reached America, there are certain grim, unavoidable parallels. For example, the way Bandai made its debut in both the US and Japan with this game, Kinnikuman, Muscle Tag Match. Kinnikuman translates from Japanese into English as Muscle Man, from which we get this release's US title, and in fact the name of the entire toy line it connected to. This will cause NES fans to regretfully look at this cartridge and recall a dire release from the early days of that console, Muscle Tag Team Match. Anyone who, for some unknown reason, plays Kinnikuman Muscle Tag Match instead of Muscle Tag Team Match will find both releases to be almost identical. Almost. The Japanese version, like its source material, contains a lot of content that would raise dismayed eyebrows in the West. Racial stereotypes imported from dated Western media without the creators necessarily understanding the history of that imagery, that sort of thing. That includes a Nazi-themed wrestler named Brocken Jr., who wears Nazi regalia and uses a remarkably tasteless wrestling move called the Nazi Gas Attack, a war criminal who can be freely selected as a playable character in Kinnikuman for Famicom. Thankfully, Bandai tagged that loser out for a different character for America, Geronimo, who is still an eyebrow-raising stereotype admittedly, but at least Geronimo doesn't turn actual genocide into a fun, thematic wrestling finisher. Otherwise, though, the Japanese version plays exactly the same as the American release that came a year later. 1 or 2 players take control of a wrestling character from the Muscle property and choppily move around the ring, maneuvering to gain an advantage over their opponent. Combat consists of basic strikes and jumps that can be modified into jump kicks. You can also perform slightly more advanced actions like rebounding off the ropes to attempt a lariat and things like that. Every few seconds, a glowing orb makes its appearance in the ring, and whichever character manages to snag it becomes temporarily supercharged and can smack the bejesus out of their opponent. When you find your tiny little WrestleMan growing weary, you can tag out by moving to the turnbuckle post in the upper corner and swapping places with your other team member. Play consists entirely of repeating this simple cycle until someone loses, although arguably anyone playing this game has already lost. Unfortunately, as a newly minted Famicom publisher, Bandai did not have the internal staff to develop Kinnikuman themselves. So, for this one instance, they commissioned an external studio to create this project. Just kidding. To my knowledge, Bandai never actually had internal development teams, and always relied on contractors to make their games. In this case, Bandai hired their future favorite, Tosei, whose work we've already seen a few times on Famicom, mostly with Jaleco games. Now don't get me wrong, Tosei has been responsible through the years for many games, maybe thousands by this point, and some of them have been excellent. When a publisher gives Tosei the time and resources to make something great, Tosei can deliver. That said, I can't think of a whole lot of 8-bit Bandai games that make you step back and say, damn, that was so good. The publisher's MO throughout its existence prior to merging with Namco appears to have been giving devs just enough time and money to slap together a quick and dirty tie-in with one of the myriad toy and cartoon properties it controlled the rights to. And the results rarely made anyone except maybe shareholders happy. Heck, even Masanobu Endo couldn't pull together a great Gundam game under Bandai's structure. When the creator of Xevious and Tower of DRUAGA delivers a dud, you know you've messed up real bad. That bare-bones contracting ethic makes its debut here, and Tosei delivers about as well as you'd expect for a company most likely strapped by the publisher for cash and time. This was the first Famicom release to feature pro wrestling, a pastime every bit as popular in Japan as here in the US. It tied in with a hit manga, whose popular television adaptation had been airing for several years by this point. And there were neat toys you could buy and collect. The packaging featured the proper and a compelling way. The game shipped in an appealingly unique cartridge, molded in a vivid red plastic with a distinctive round form factor that Bandai would use as their standard for Famicom games. Everything external to this game said, buy me, and based on the number of these candy-like carts you can find on store shelves in retro shops these days, Kinnikuman sold really well. far better than a game with such lousy controls and sputtery animation and a playable Nazi deserved. Bandai's reign of terror over the Famicom begins here. Now, 1985 has seen the Famicom ascendant, but just as Super Mario Bros. Marked the culmination of game design ambition on the console, the advent of Bandai turns the page on a new, grimmer era, an era of opportunistic publishers rushing to cash in on the so-called Famicom boom. Quality and integrity be damned. Well, it's not all bad. This week also sees the debut of another new face on Famicom, developer Magical, aka Home Data, who programmed both the arcade and home versions of Sky Destroyer for Taito. Home Data may not be a household name, but the company worked quietly in the background for decades, mostly producing games that never came to the US. NES fans probably know them best as the development team behind IREM's oddball submarine shooter Scoon, which meant that Home Data was responsible for illustrating the only visible female nipples to appear in a licensed NES game, making them a hero to desperately horny youngsters in an era before they could just download porn to their phones for free. You won't find such titillation here, however. Sky Destroyer is all business, and that business involves shooting airplanes out of the sky. As the second forward-scrolling shooter we've seen on Famicom, Sky Destroyer does not seem quite as desperate to be Xevious as Game.O.S. did. I mean, you still command both air-to-air and air-to-ground attacks, but since the action takes place over the ocean, the latter attacks are technically air-to-sea torpedoes, and thus have far more limited use. I believe you may eventually reach land, as the progression in this game sees you slowly making your way to a remote island, according to the title screen, but to be honest, I've never been able to make landfall. Sky Destroyer has fangs, and does not make its mission easy. Thematically, it shares a lot in common with Capcom's 1942, which would ship less than a month after Sky Destroyer. But while the difficulty balancing in the home conversion of 1942 let you slip into a comfortable groove and sort of zone out to the hypnotic screech of that so-called soundtrack as you fight endless waves of fighter craft, Sky Destroyer takes its name literally and attempts to destroy you with everything in the sky. Waves of enemy planes appear as specks on the horizon before growing in size as they rush past you. Somewhere along the way you can try to shoot them down, but they fire back at you with fast, practically hit-scan projectiles that will tear through your plane and send you down in flames with a single shot. After a while, large bomber craft appear at the top of the skybox, launching attacks at you and requiring several direct hits to their engines before they'll go down. And missile cruisers appear on the surface of the water, far in the distance, representing targets of opportunity more than they do threats. You need to strike with a torpedo before they scurry off again to safety in order to take them out. For a Famicom 1985 release, Sky Destroyer does a pretty good job of presenting a superscalar style effect. It arrived in Japan just a couple of weeks after Sega launched the Mark III alongside Hang On, and while the scaling and speed of this shooter can't compare to Sega's seminal Racer, I'd say this game still acquits itself pretty well. The enemy fighters move around and grow in size almost as convincingly as the ones Konami would present with a more advanced mapper chip 2 years later in Top Gun. And unlike in that game, Sky Destroyer even throws in some visual grace notes. Some planes don't simply explode and vanish when hit, but instead take a freefall nosedive into the sea. And even more impressively, Home Data managed to create a vast skybox for Sky Destroyer. The Famicom hardware, as we all know, did not support multi-directional scrolling right out of the box. And to date, the only developer who seemed to grasp how to coax that feature from the console at this point has been Hudson with Raid on Bungling Bay and Challenger. And now here's a game where your plane's movement causes the camera to pan in that direction, even at diagonals. Moving laterally along the horizon causes the screen to scroll infinitely in 360 degrees, and your current bearing has no visible impact on the action, so it's not exactly realistic. But you can elevate your viewpoint and descend, making the effective navigable space about 2 screens high. Besides making a strong impression in terms of programming prowess, this arcade-inspired tech feat also adds to Sky Destroyer's difficulty level. The active play area ahead of your plane spans more airspace than fits on the screen at any given moment, and that means you can't always see the danger that threatens you. Enemy fighters, especially those oversized bombers, can take potshots at you from outside of your visual range. Simply flying in a beeline toward the horizon is a great way to let yourself be caught unawares by foes firing at you from just out of sight. You need to bank up and down in order to avoid presenting a juicy static target that enemies can easily pepper with projectiles, juking and weaving your way through the sky while also doing your best to line up your opponents in your crosshairs. Honestly, I'm a little surprised that Sky Destroyer didn't make its way to the US. We actually didn't see any behind-the-plane shooters like this until long after Top Gun had arrived. Maybe if Taito had entered the NES market a little sooner, they could have included this alongside Elevator Action and Arkanoid. Then again, maybe they rightly intuited that publishing a game where you play as a Zero fighter single-handedly wiping out the American Pacific Fleet wouldn't really sell in 1980s Peoria, when the US media was already full of panicked reactionary anxiety about how Japan was about to conquer the world economically. Although it seems like only fair counterprogramming when you have an American fighter doing the reverse in 1942. Yeah, already we can see the fruits of Reagan abolishing the fairness doctrine in action. In what appears to be a new speed record for Famicom, we have a sequel to a game that shipped a mere 6 months earlier. Well, sort of. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun is one part unauthorized sequel, one part living manifestation of the maxim that possession is 9/10 of the law. Jaleco published a pretty rough home conversion of UPL's arcade title Ninja-Kun in May 1985, and here in November, Jaleco publishes a very obvious follow-up in Ninja Jajamaru-Kun. UPL doesn't have any involvement with this one, however. It's strictly a Jaleco joint, with Tosei providing development services. I don't know if Jaleco paid UPL any sort of license for this game, but I kinda doubt it. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun contains just enough differences from Ninja-Kun to make it reasonably distinct and prevent it from being legally actionable. For example, the main character isn't called Ninja-Kun, he's called Ninja Jajamaru-Kun. See, totally different. And while the action works more or less the same, with a little red ninja killing a set number of foes per stage by leaping up through platforms and tossing shuriken, this game scrolls horizontally rather than vertically. Those two things aren't the same at all. Whatever the financials and legalities behind this offshoot, Jajamaru-Kun, the character, would completely eclipse Ninja-Kun in terms of popularity, sales, and durability. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun would sell 1 million units and spawn half a dozen sequels across a variety of platforms, becoming one of the pillars of Jaleco's 8-bit business. Ninja-Kun got a single 1987 arcade follow-up that moved exactly 0 needles and vanished from the face of history. This sort of thing tended to happen a lot in the 1980s. Copyright law was still a little shaky where video games were concerned. And if corporations like to do anything, it's push at the boundaries of what the courts will allow in order to make more money. We saw this happen with Nintendo and Donkey Kong. They saw the game code that Ikegami Tsushinki created under contract as their own property, since after all they commissioned it, and used it as the base for an internally developed sequel, Donkey Kong Jr. We saw it happen with Midway and Pac-Man. They licensed Pac-Man from Namco and promptly set about producing a variety of unauthorized sequels of wildly varying quality. And here on Famicom, Hudson would pull this off at least twice. A few months back, they licensed Star Force from Tekken, which they'd rework into the Star Soldier series. And in 1986, we'd see their licensed take on Wonder Boy, Adventure Island, which would run in parallel to the Wonder Boy series and actually end up seeing more sequels than Wesstone's own franchise. Anyway, with Ninja Jajamaru-Kun, we have a case where the derivative game doesn't just eclipse the original in terms of sales and durability, but also quality, which probably accounts for the better sales and durability, come to think of it. Ninja-Kun was okay, but the home conversion felt like an exercise in CIA psyops. How much discomfort can we inflict on people as they attempt to have fun? With choppy animation, strobing visuals, awful color palette choices, and sticky controls, Ninja-Kun constantly flirted with the idea of being enjoyable without ever quite getting there. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun, on the other hand, brings just enough refinement to the table to be tolerable for more than 30 seconds at a time. Rather than scaling mountains with your awful jump physics like some badly programmed ice climber set in feudal Japan, now you navigate a series of dojos. Each dojo spans a couple of screens in width and never scrolls upward. Instead, each building consists of 4 floors. This puts it in the same general proto-platformer category as something like Mappy and City Connection. Tosei didn't do quite as good a job here on the technical front as we saw with those other games, though. Like just about everything else we've seen from Tosei so far, Ninja Jajamaru-Kun feels a little choppy, with scrolling and animation that lack the rock-solid precision of Namco's work. It feels and plays better than Ninja-Kun did, though, so at least we can see an upward arc of quality taking shape. Tosei has more or less set the low bar for Famicom development to this point, but their work would improve, while vastly less impressive devs would make their way to Famicom soon. I do question Jaleco's strategy in releasing this and the largely similar City Connection less than 2 months apart, but it doesn't seem to have hurt either game. Both sold like gangbusters, and both remain well beloved by Famicom fans all these years later. And in fairness, they do play pretty differently within the format. Where City Connection took place in an endless loop and never allowed players to slow down or stop for a breather, every stage in Ninja Jajamaru-Kun consists of a defined space with boundaries at either end. It also rewards you for not just barreling straight ahead, but rather for plotting your own path through the dojos. Each tier of a stage exists as a standalone space patrolled by various ninja and yokai, and those enemies will stick to their respective floor until Jajamaru smashes through the breakable portions of the building structure to connect the levels together. Once the barriers between floors break away, enemies and Jajamaru-Kun alike can pass freely from one to the other. That means simply plowing ahead and immediately making your way to the top floor creates a chaotic situation where enemies can easily surround you and hit you unawares. On the other hand, you don't want to advance too slowly because eventually the main villain, who lurks at the top of the screen where he's kidnapped another one of those princesses that 8-bit villains seem so fond of abducting, will begin dropping bombs at you. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun contains a strong balance of play factors to encourage, but not force, certain tactics, leaving the player to determine their own ideal approach. Breaking floors will sometimes reveal power-ups, some of which seem a little out of place, like the giant rideable roller skate, but they do add a certain X factor to the action, and that keeps things lively. Ninja Jajamaru-Kun fared well enough to become a fixture of the Famicom. Beyond the sequels, Jaleco has republished this game many times over, including on PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, Switch, and even Evercade. More recently, Strictly Limited Games published a Switch collection along with new cartridges for most of the series' legacy releases, many localized for the first time. But perhaps the hardest of hardcore Western gamers know Ninja Jajamaru-Kun not for the game itself, but rather for Retro Game Challenge for Nintendo DS, where it appeared in homage form as the first Robot Ninja Haggleman game. Anyway, Ninja Jajamaru-Kun cements Jaleco's standing as a Famicom powerhouse. As for UPL, who came up with this concept in the first place, well, they got ninja'd. Next time on NES Works, we take a trip to Kitty City.